Hi, this is Paul, and I'm going to continue my series, Words That Fudge. And this month's word that fudges is saved or salvation. And if you're in an evangelical Christian community, this is a code word for going to heaven when you die or not going to hell. May true if you're in a Roman Catholic situation or an Orthodox situation or a Christian Reformed church or many, many other churches. Saved in many cases is a code word, and the code word means you're going to heaven and you're avoiding hell. And I've been wrestling with this word for years, and so there's going to be a fair amount of autobiography in this video. When I learned Greek and Hebrew in seminary, I noticed that the words that are beneath what's often translated saved in both Hebrew and Greek are much broader than the little code meanings within the Christian faith. That you can be saved from a flood, you can be saved from a famine, you can be saved from a lion, you can be saved from starvation, you can be saved from bankruptcy. Saved is a very broad word. We use it for many different circumstances, and so that its coded meaning, when people use it as the coded meaning, it's what they're doing. So right away I was stuff in my consciousness Congress was wrestling with this word, and there for a long time has been the idea that Christians can sometimes be so heavenly minded to be of no earthly good. Pie in the sky, by and by, escapist religion, especially dispensationalism. It's okay to let the world burn and the people suffer. There was a lot of political talk back in the era of the religious right that the Christians don't care about the environment because this world is going to burn up, and so we might as well use up all the oil and just use the world up, and we don't have any need to care for it. And this became a cliche. I don't find it often true, but this became a meme of sorts. And this became a way to dismiss Christians, and sometimes Christians used it as a way of dismissing the need to be involved in politics or involved in issues in this world. There are Christian songs, "This world is not my home," "I'll fly away." I was raised in a racial reconciliation church where in the abolition of Jim Crow, you could see very positive change in people's lives. And so within the Christian church, there was a pretty vigorous debate about whether or not Christians should be involved in politics. And these debates continued into the 80s, when in many ways the fundamentalist churches and different conservative elements of the Christian church got re-engaged in politics. And so there have been a lot of debates within Christianity and within the church over these issues for a very, very long time. Now, when I went to the DR, one of the things that I saw very clearly was, well, we could make an individual person's life better, and this sometimes would take the form of finding some young, sharp, intelligent Dominican or Haitian person and filling them full of our education, maybe even moving them to the United States for a time to get the same training I did, in the hopes that they would move back to the Dominican Republic and be able to serve in that context. But what missionaries had seen for years was that often if you move someone out of their context and train them in the United States, they're not coming back, and for very good reason, and you can't really blame them. Our capacity to rescue groups is less than our capacity to rescue individuals. And we see this on the political stage after Iraq, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We've got a lot more skepticism about our capacity to do nation building, and we've been in Afghanistan a very long time. Culture is very real, and groups have a fair amount of inertia in terms of the things that they have. And so while there was a lot of optimism brought into the church because of the real strides that were made in the racial reconciliation era in terms of the lives of African Americans, improvements that were brought into their lives in the 50s and 60s, and then into the 70s. Since the 70s, that has in many ways stalled, and you can listen to Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter talk about that quite effectively, I think. But one of the things that, again, when I was in the Dominican Republic, there was so little we could do to help the material prospects of these people. Most of them were not going to live long enough to see potentially the benefits of whatever contribution we were making as missionaries to their lives, and a lot of those contributions could be wiped out. One of the things that my mentor in the DR often emphasized was that we're going to do education, because when the Dominican Guardia Nacional would come in and clean out Haitians from Batays for whatever political reason for that moment, their education goes with them because it's between their ears, whereas a lot of the material things that they would have, they could get taken and stolen, moth and rust consume. So one of the things that I learned in the DR was just how little good we could do to benefit people in communities, how resistant communities and cultures were to the kinds of changes that we thought would bring them, would help them flourish. And then also, in keeping with that, the realization of how little we actually had to offer them, how our ideas for their improvement were so often so deeply contextualized within our context that it didn't really help them. We're full of these good ideas that they simply rejected, probably wisely, because it didn't make their lives any better. So then I returned to the U.S., and if we believe we can save the world by improving our material and social circumstances, life for Americans should be the near coming of the kingdom of God. Most of us in the Dominican Republic, the lights were on and off, the water was on and off, there was a lot of corruption. Just getting anything done sometimes was difficult. Here in the United States, things work. The lights stay on. You actually run clocks with electrical power because it's that reliable, and corruption is not anywhere near what it was in the Dominican Republic, and people are wealthy and affluent, and even the poor here have more opportunity and are far better in terms of material and social circumstance. While there is hunger, and while nutrition might not be where it should be, most people in the United States are not going to bed hungry. Again, some do, but the United States and many places in the West, life is so much better. But why isn't it better even still? In a sense, we've resolved third world problems, and when we do, we collapse into first world problems. And now, as we continue to go on with the developments of the culture war, it seems that first world problems actually breed second world problems. Now, those of you who are unfamiliar with the nomenclature of first, second, and third world, first world is, again, the developed world like we live in the United States, very affluent, materialistic, prosperous, quite stable, corruption levels are quite low. Third world problem, the developing world, much more difficult in terms of material circumstances, no middle class, big difference between the wealthy and the poor. Infrastructure is poorly developed, educational resources are poorly developed, you're kind of stuck in your class. It's really a third world problem. Second world was the communist world. And so this, again, this entire conversation about, well, in North America, we're wrestling with first world problems, and it seems as we wrestle with first world problems, we're bringing in second world solutions and therefore second world problems. And again, Jordan Peterson has spoken about this. Many of the other channels, that those of you who are listening to my channel that are listening to, speak quite a bit about this. So there's this connection between, well, eliminate those third world problems, and then you bring in first world problems, and it seems on the heel of trying to solve your first world problems, you bring up second world problems of tyranny, of political tyranny. So, of course, I came back to the United States and I started pastoring a local church. And a big part of my job pastoring a local church is just working on the Bible and explaining the Bible. And so those of you who watch my sermons and my Sunday school class know that I just spend a lot of time in the Bible. I think that's one of the most important thing that churches can do. And to try and connect, John Stott has, I had it right here, I mentioned it in a previous video. John Stott, English, evangelical, died a few years ago, between two worlds. That's what preaching is about. we're trying to connect in the 20th century. Now we're in the 21st. We're trying to connect the two worlds, the world of the Bible and this world. And so that's and this context. And so that's what my job is as a preacher. Now, the Bible posits a level of salvation we have not attained. And you can read that in the Old Testament prophets, where the lion lays down with the lamb, where the one who harvests overtakes the one who's sowing. These beautiful pictures in the Old Testament. Let justice roll down like waters. All of these beautiful pictures of flourishing and of peace, and everyone with their own allotment and inheritance, where no one dies young and life is secure. And then in the New Testament, again, more beautiful pictures. The book of Revelation, yeah, there's a lot of blood, but towards the end of the book, there's a lot of very glorious pictures that really builds on the book of Isaiah and a number of the other Old Testament prophets. And so as I wrestled with that, well, what does salvation mean here? We need to be saved, and the more I work on it, the more I realize we need to be saved from ourselves. That's sort of first world problems. I am my biggest problem. And it's not mere circumstance, and this is where the victim ethos really runs astray, because if you imagine yourself perpetually to be a victim of some other evil force that is doing you wrong, you cut off the opportunity to actually make real progress in your life if in fact you are your biggest problem. And I think in most cases that is often the truth. And so we need to be saved from ourselves. I am my biggest problem, and not merely circumstance. And I saw this again in the Dominican Republic. Humans can joyfully endure and transcend bad circumstance, which is actually often useful for progress. And you see that all the time. You'll find it was so funny because you'd bring North American work teams down to the Dominican Republic, and one of the things we would hear from Canadians and Americans all the time was they seem so happy. And I think the reason first world people would say that of third world people was that it's so built into our mind that our happiness is simply a function of the material prosperity around us. 2 cars in every garage and a chicken in every pot and a spouse that you enjoy, so on and so forth, that we forget that no, that's part of the equation, not the whole thing. And again, read Jonathan Haidt's wonderful book, The Happiness Hypothesis. He goes into a bunch of these happiness studies, and they're well worth reflecting, and you begin to realize that it is not so simple. Resolving, if your focus, as it has become, is on eliminating mental anguish, to simply give people more stuff does not resolve the issues. You will find suicide goes up in affluent nations and is lower in poor nations. And if our thesis that happiness and fulfillment and well-being were simply a function of material circumstance, we wouldn't expect to see that kind of data. So humans destroy good circumstance regularly and turn it into hell on earth. This is Dostoevsky's piano key argument. This is something that you can get by reading Tolstoy's Confessions. Now, I had always been interested in Buddhism too, and that again part is some of the function of growing up in this culture. The West has often kind of had this lingering flirtation with ideas from the East, and one of my favorite music bands growing up was Kansas, and of course Dust in the Wind, and a lot of the Buddhist symbolism in the songs of Kansas. The Buddhist tradition has a lot to say about the ego. And there are some similarity with the cruciform call to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. But what really why I couldn't go there into Buddhism was it eliminated suffering by eliminating the thing that suffers, which is the self, and the desires that cause it. And I wanted to keep me, I wanted to keep my ego and desire, because we desire many good things. My children, having children is a transformative, that word is getting overused. Having children is a transformative experience, and you begin to see that, wow, you really love these kids, and what wouldn't you do for these kids? And the just the amazing thing of raising children and watching them grow and watching them transform and relating to them and just having a front row seat on the amazing thing that human development is. Wow, there's glory in that. And glory and desire are closely tied. And so I didn't see eliminating suffering at the cost of eliminating desire, and my ego and myself was really worth it. And Christianity is a very ambitious religion. Now, I need to be saved from myself, but myself isn't extinguished in the process. In other words, a few weeks ago I preached on Jesus removes an unclean spirit from a man in a synagogue in Mark chapter 1. And this again is like the Gandalf's exorcism of Theoden, that Theoden must be saved and Saruman must be cast out, but Theoden must be saved to be the kind of king he was made to be. And so I need to be saved from myself, but myself itself can't be extinguished in the process. And that's a very difficult task. I get to keep me in Christianity, but a better perfected me. And again, I struggle with that. Christianity talks about mortification and sanctification. Mortification is dying to yourself. Sanctification is yourself being sanctified. So Christianity has that, and I get to keep my story, unlike ideas about reincarnation where some self that I am alienated from, that I am unconscious of, that perhaps maybe some super spiritual people can do things to get involved with their past lives. But don't forget, the whole goal of the business about karma and reincarnation is to leave the system and once again join that great sea of being, that one thing. And in Christianity, myself is redeemed and transformed and translated and saved. And I want that. My grandmother, I don't know where she got this idea. After my grandfather died, my grandmother had this idea that she wouldn't recognize my grandfather in the age to come, in the next life. And so she would sometimes get a little despairing, and I was in college and seminary close to the senior complex where they lived, and so I would visit my grandmother, and she would talk in despairing ways about never seeing Grandpa again. I'd say, Grandma, what are you talking about? Of course you'll see him again. Nope, I won't recognize him. And I'm thinking, oh, where on earth did you get this idea? I won't recognize him. And, well, based on some of Jesus' sayings about marriage, your relationship with him won't be in that next life what it was in this life. But I myself very much anticipate seeing my father and my grandmother and my grandfather and a reunion with my dead relatives. And I think I'll know who they are, and I think they'll know who I am. And while our relationships will be different than they were in this age, this is a part of the joy. And if you read Miroslav Volf's Exclusion, I should pull it off the shelf, it's better to show. Miroslav Volf's Exclusion and Embrace, which is it's not an easy book, but he wrestles with the question of maintaining yourself and your memory going into the age to come. Can there be forgiveness and reconciliation between old enemies? And I think in the Roman Catholic tradition, purgatory gives them a space for some of this, and I understand the Protestant ideas for not teaching purgatory. But there's, the questions raised by this book are real questions, and questions that thoughtful Christians think about. But again, with Christianity, I get to keep my story. Paul Vanderklay, the Paul Vanderklay that you see and know now this is just the beginning. And I talked with Josh about that. This is just the beginning of my story, and we don't know. Maybe it was Josh, maybe it was Jack. I'll post both of those. They both gave agreement to post the conversations. this is just the beginning of who I am. It's further up and further in, and the, as C.S. Lewis notes, the you ain't seen nothing yet in terms of me, and the same is true of me to you in terms of the life of the age to come. That this that what God has planned for us is better than we can imagine. That's, boy, that's salvation, because it's saved at every level. Of course, Rose says of Jack in the movie Titanic, he saved me in every way a woman can be saved. And I pull that out for sermons now and then. And no, Rose, you're divinizing romantic love, and romantic love again is a good gift, but it's not. But you can't elevate it to be the top gift in the hierarchy. And we're going to get into that when I play a little bit of clip from Vervaeke and Peterson a little bit later. But this is something I'm not going to give up. This is something I believe this is central to what to me is so attractive about Christianity and why it is so worth pursuing. I also get to keep desire and my desires. Now, the New Testament is not naive to the difficulty of desire. Paul talks about epithumia often, this overwhelming desire. And yet even epithumia, that's what the angels have in terms of looking into this amazing process of the gospel and salvation that is going on before them. But somehow the desires have to be worked. And actually, I think it's Augustine who comes and says our desires need to be ordered. And that's basically a hierarchy. And if our desires are properly ordered, we can enjoy food, we can enjoy sex, we can enjoy fellowship, we can enjoy all of these good things if in fact our orders, our loves are properly desired. And of course, Augustine was very helpful in that. And they need to be reordered, because when they're out of order, when our loves are not within a proper hierarchy, that's when trouble starts. So I had all sorts of, and continue to have all sorts of materialist secular biases built into me from my context, but I also have my Christian formation that hedges against it. And so that's why in the last video on Vervaeke, I have my Consciousness Congress, and there's a pretty strong secular materialist faction in my Consciousness Congress, and they get their say. They're in there, but there's also deep Christian formation that has happened in the church, and through reading of the Bible, and through prayer, and through experience of Christian fellowship, and through traveling broadly and looking at Christians from other cultures that are not coming from our materialist assumptions, and reading church fathers, and reading old Christian works that were before modernity to give windows into those other worlds. That's part of the reason I love history. The study of history is actually time travel in a sense, because I can think with minds of other ages. And this is part of the reason that C.S. Lewis was so fervent against chronological snobbery, that if we actually want to know something, we need to practice diversity, not only in terms of cultures horizontally today, but in terms of cultures throughout time. And that kind of diversity can help us gain perspective and help us get out of the bubble of the now that has so deeply formed us and is actually limiting our thoughts. And so I saw this at play in my seeing Haitians transcend their physical suffering in Christianity. And Haitians would go after the gospel and live within it. And even though they in many ways had very little hope for the kind of material security and prosperity that I was simply given by virtue of when and where I was born and by the communities I'm connected with, they didn't have that. But I watched their living faith transcend their suffering. And I actually, that had such an impact even in my internship. I came back to the United States for my ordination examinations, and one of the pastors there, I had to do some writing for it. One of the pastors there really tagged me in terms of an insufficient realized eschatology. Now that's theological jargon, but that I was not sufficiently balanced in terms of understanding the way that the gospel impacts culture now. Because now remember, I come from a Calvinist background. If you go to a place like Calvin College, one aspect of Abraham Kuyper's work was the realization of the kingdom. And today I much more live with bearing witness to the kingdom rather than actual kingdom bringing in the kingdom. I don't think we really do that. I've got too much of the antithesis in my matrix. I think we bear witness to the kingdom, but I think all of our attempts at manifesting the kingdom fall short, and that's why I, especially after all of these months working on the Jordan Peterson stuff, that the more we slip into utopian thinking, the more we are in danger of bringing hell up when we're trying to bring heaven down. So, I got grief on that in my classical examination, but I passed anyway. And so one of the things that I've been working on a long time has been the realization that the Bible is not the story of heaven and hell. The Bible is the story of the reunion of heaven and earth. And I think the best biblical scholars point that out. And I think the reduction of the Bible to a story of heaven and hell is a reduction, and it's not biblical, because the main themes of the Bible are heaven and earth, and you find that again and again, heaven and earth. And part of the reason I came to that was because the emphasis, and this is, I think, partly from medieval Catholicism and then the response in the Reformation, a lot of the fight between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants got into the question, how do we get to heaven? Works, grace, indulgences, all of those elements of the story. And what somewhat got left behind was the world, was the earth. And so I think a lot of the biblical scholarship done in the last 50, 75 years has, especially in terms of what we've learned about ancient Near East culture, is the Bible is very much the story of the unification of heaven and earth. And if you read Joshua Butler, I mentioned his book, Skeletons in God's Closet. There's a nice treatment of applying that kind of thinking to the kinds of distortions that heaven versus hell thinking has tended to bring into the church. And again, a lot of that focused on this word salvation, because if salvation gets reduced to hell avoidance, well, what does that have to say about how we spend our time? And I think that has tended to create a situation in evangelicalism where the only thing that matters is getting people saved. And see, I want to be careful with that, because it is not the case that I don't believe in the work of evangelism. And the work of evangelism, much more in the Tim Keller school on that. If I'm preaching a sermon about Christian living, that's the work of evangelism. Life isn't disconnected into this rather Gnostic idea of the main thing I need to do is get your soul into heaven. The Bible doesn't talk that way. At least it doesn't talk that way very often and very much. And the times that it does talk that way are integrated into a richer picture. And I usually rather use the language of participating in the age to come, because nobody talks about hell more than Jesus. And to not listen to Jesus on this frame, exclusion in the great feast, banquet of the patriarchs, the feast of the Lamb, exclusion from the party. And Jesus, so often with his stories, his parables of hell, it's a locked door, and it's outer darkness, and it's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And I think C.S. Lewis was very helpful in that, in a strange way, those outside the party wouldn't like the party anyway. And in a sense, with the locked, well, this is more me than Lewis, and maybe I'll post a link to a blog post I wrote years ago on this. They wouldn't like the party anyway. And so in a sense, part of what hell means is those who are disgruntled about God's joy and glory no longer get the opportunity to ruin the party for everyone else. That's the exclusionary aspect to it. So I know there are some who listen to me that are universalists of one stripe or another. I'm not a universalist, and I very much do believe in Christian conversion, in the quickening, in the and again, this is tied to what I see as salvation, which is the renovation of ourselves, along with the renovation and the renewal of the material world. And people have asked about that. If you want to read a good book on that, you can read N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope. And this is actually one of my favorite books by N.T. Wright. And it's not one of his fat technical books. It's a middle brow. I must have spilled something on it. It's a middle brow treatment. It's very accessible. It's very readable if you've got a good high school or a college education. And he walks through rethinking heaven, the resurrection, and the mission of the church. Now I differ with N.T. Wright on some things in terms of really how I articulate the mission of the church, and it gets into some of this question about bearing witness to the age to come versus realizing the age to come. And see, realizing and bearing witness are very, very close. I don't think we can actually get there in all of its fullness in this age. And I already mentioned my questions about utopianism and such. So now let's keep going. So this is the integration of heaven and earth. One of probably the time that I got the closest to actually writing a book was a number of years ago when I was trying to figure out how to communicate the gospel to materialists. And actually the crack in the armor is something that I just noticed again in rewatching the Vervaeke Jordan Peterson conversation that I'm going to play in a little while in this video. Because in about minute 21, he talks about the reality of relationships in terms of things being in relation to one another. And that's exactly where I was going in terms of thinking about if you understand the self and what the self is, and the fact that, well, I know myself, but my wife, for example, knows aspects of myself that I am blind to, sometimes willfully blind. My children know aspects of myself that I am blind to. My parents know and knew aspects of myself that I am blind to. There are aspects of myself that are actually embedded in my ancestors, and there are aspects of myself that will be manifest in this world after I die. If you begin to ask the question, well, what is the self? And I can't even know myself. And so actually what you need is some monarchical vision and some monarchical visionary, some monarch who has capacity for this vision to actually know me. And apart from that monarch, I cannot actually be fully known. But that monarch would have to have basically complete knowledge of me, better than I have from the inside out, complete knowledge of me, better than the loved ones around me have from the outside in. And you begin to run that mental experiment, and where you wind up with is God. And so, okay, what does it mean? A human being is essentially a story. Again, this is part of when I was trying to, okay, what is the soul? What is the self? Well, the human being is essentially a story, and so my soul is in a sense my story, and that's why these old experiments, they would try and put somebody who's dying on a very sensitive scale to see if they could weigh the soul as it left, thinking of the soul as something material, but actually the soul is a story. And what is a story? A story is in a sense a matrix of information, of relational information and data. That's one way to conceptualize and represent a story. And so that's what your soul is. Well, what happens to your soul? Well, God knows. It's in the cloud. God has it in its server. But as cognitive psychology has been showing, and Jordan Peterson, turned me on to a lot of this, and now Vervaeke in terms of watching his stuff, it's got to be embedded and embodied, because in many ways, apart from the context and this rich world that we inhabit of every layer, the soul means nothing. It's just a story. And so I can pull a biography. Here's a wonderful biography of Jonathan Edwards by George Marsden. I can pull a biography off the shelf, and to some degree, Jonathan Edwards, aspects of the soul of Jonathan Edwards are contained in this book, but similarly, they're not actually in the materiality of this book. What of Jonathan Edwards? What of his soul is in this book? Now, obviously, this is just a very tiny representation of all that Jonathan Edwards was, even in a fat book like this. But Christians believe that in the resurrection, Jonathan Edwards will be reconstituted. And Jonathan Edwards, well, then we get into the time conversation. We're going to leave that to the side for now. But Jonathan Edwards will be perfected and renewed. And the amazing things that Jonathan Edwards accomplished in his life and thought about, much of which, if you think about everything you think about and accomplish, you forget, isn't recorded in books, is lost to the age of decay and the sands of time. Well, God knows, and this, in fact, is restored and renewed. And I think about this often. I think about every time I do a funeral, and I do a fair number of funerals because I pastor an aging congregation. Every time I do a funeral, I think about the loss to this world of the wisdom and the knowledge and the beauty and the capacity of everyone we put in the ground. And every time I visit someone who has dementia, I think about the loss. And the family experiences the loss of that person and their story. And again, Christianity gives me so much hope. And because salvation is not just, well, this person will be in heaven, but it's the salvation of everything about them. And this is what I loved about C.S. Lewis and The Last Battle, in terms of that representation where they could go back and they could see the house that they knew had been destroyed, and they could see their parents, and in fact their parents weren't dead to them. And when you begin to be able to imagine the picture of what this means, this vision in Christianity of the, well, it's represented in Isaiah 60 of the kings of the earth bringing back the lost people of the exile of Jerusalem, of all of the loss of this world, and how God knows it all and somehow is able to redeem it and reform it and reconstitute it in new heavens and new earth. We don't know how, because we can't think of it, because the representations that we can create are so limited, but God is able to do so much more. And so here's another biography. The renewed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., well, he's not going to have to fight what he fought there, but what will he have to contribute in the age to come? And when Dr. King meets Jonathan Edwards, what conversations are they going to have? Well, they'll be limited by time. No, they won't. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've known less days to sing God's praise than when we first began. So what's going to happen when these two are together, and compound that on and on and on, and the great saints that have been out there that none of us have time in our life to know, and on and on and on. And when you begin to imagine the life of the age to come, it not only says, well, that diminishes our life here. Not really, because what you are doing in this world is actually contributing to the next age. The growth and the discovery and the witness and the work that you do, whether it's farming rice or pest control or fixing airplane engines or being a school teacher, all of that you bring with you into the life of the age to come. And so actually it's not so much, I can die now and quick get into that. In Christ, and this is the realized eschatology, in Christ you are already beginning to work in the age to come while you're working here and now. And that suddenly adds a whole new augmented reality filter to everything you do now before you die. In other words, it is joy upon joy. And I see this, what's happening with these videos more than I'd ever expected. And one of the things that I hope for is that one day in the age to come, now many of you, some of you try to have a conversation with me and I send you the link and then you say, oh, there's no spots available. Yeah, because I've got to have limited spots. I've got my church I've got to preserve, and I've got my family time, and I've got to keep making videos. And so I say, okay, I've got this many hours a week to just do these video conversations. And then, about half of them I can share with all of you, and you enjoy that. But we're all limited by this time. Well, in the age to come, we won't have those kinds of limitations. And you and I can sit down and we can talk for hours. We can have our fill of conversation and exploring, and then we'll bring in someone else, and then we'll bring in someone else, and sometime it'll be one-on-one, and sometime it'll be in a group, and then let's go talk to Dr. King, and then let's go talk to Jonathan Edwards, and on and on and on and on and on and on, and so what I do in this world then gets carried over and translated into the next, and when you have a vision for that, it's like, yeah, this is optimistic. Yeah, this is hopeful. No, I don't want to die. I've got, the normal human desire to keep living, but at the same time, wow, what am I expecting? It's very real to me, and that then just gives me more joy in this life. So I started going about their relationships. I started riffing on the age to come. A materialist could understand the Bible better through that window of relationships, of the self, of understanding what we can actually, as materialists, understand the self. And I really liked what Vervaeke said in minute 21 about the reality of relations. But we still are haunted by the split world, and there are a few little videos that I made because I was playing around with YouTube and thinking I should probably make some videos because people don't read. And so I was, doing some stuff with C.S. Lewis's Miracles. And I keep trying to figure out, well, so part of it happened because, and this is the way a lot of it goes. And if you're a pastor in real life, there was a young man who became a Christian. And part of the reason he became, well, he had a little bit of Christianity in his background, but he wasn't taking it seriously, and he really got into drugs and porn and a bunch of other things, and at the same time, fell in love and had a kid, and he began to realize if I don't get the porn and the drugs under control, I'm going to lose my marriage, and I'm going to lose my family. Well, how am I going to get the porn and the drugs under control? Well, Christianity. And so he started digging into his faith, but then he starts trying to inhabit the world of the Bible and very much runs into what many people run into, the dissonance between the cosmology of the ancient Near East and the cosmology of today. And this, in fact, is a very large topic of conversation, and many people are proposing all kinds of ways to deal with that splitness. Esther O'Reilly will send you about 100 tweets on her way. And BioLogos has pages and pages and pages of its way. And I've got ideas of my own. And Ken Ham has ideas of his own. And so this young man eventually, for the sake of his family and for the sake of preserving himself, decided that he really needed to be a flat earther. And so then, in terms of a ministry move, well, I've got a decision to make. Am I going to spend? Sometimes people comment that I do interviews with people, and I don't necessarily take on ideas that might be heretical or ideas you might even know I disagree with, or I might not challenge them on the spot. Well, there are reasons for that, because basically I'm working a hierarchy in terms of what should I talk about now and what should I press them on. And so with this young man, I've of course got many arguments that could have made that why I believe that the earth is round and not flat, and that the representation of us being on a globe going around the sun is a better one than scientifically than us, the world being flat with a dome. I would rather have him be a good husband and father. And if being a flat earther helps him with that, you go right ahead and be a flat earther. Now, he had the additional problem that he wanted to go into the sciences, and I thought, well, that's going to be tough. And, I do have a lot of respect for some creation scientists, because they're trying to keep their world together, and I think there's a place for the faithful opposition to be working on the problems from a radically different end. So, for the creation scientists, more power to you. Keep going at it. You will probably find things from your paradigm that the majority scientific community from its paradigm won't recognize, because all of our paradigms are limited and limiting, and so thinking in other ways usually brings out knowledge. And that's, Thomas Kuhn's History of Scientific Revolutions and all of that. But in his case, it was more important, for the sake of his wife and children, that he be a good father and he be a good husband. And if that meant being a flat earther, you have my blessing. You be a flat earther. And if you ask me what I think, I'll tell you what I think, but I'm not going to nag you about it. I'm not going to hassle you about it. And I'm not going to, I'm not going to disrespect you over it. And it's the same thing with conversations with political opponents and people of different ideas. I think we have to have a hierarchy of battles that we fight, and so I would rather leave some things alone. And again, if you're an evangelical and you have this hell avoidance, soul salvation idea very high on your hierarchy, well, you're probably going to criticize me, and I've got a fair number of letters of criticism from evangelicals that here I talked to this person, I had a conversation with them, and I didn't give them a gospel message. And it's like, that this person grew up in church. He heard those words many times. And so actually I think evangelization is probably best going to happen in terms of helping them be reunited to Christ, probably in a different way. And so that'll give you a little bit of insight into some of the decisions I make about what I say and when I say it. Genesis 1 has dome on a disc versus round balls going around the sun. Some Christians demand a biblical anthropology, but then I'll say, but what about a biblical physiology? Well, what do you mean? What about a biblical anatomy? Do you believe with your heart or do you believe with your head? And then they kind of say, well, but there are neurons down there. But it's like, yeah, but that's kind of like saying the waters above are clouds. It really doesn't finally hold. That concept of truth and literalism and the Bible, I don't find helps. But at the same time, there are ways in which literalism in the Bible is really important. And I believe this in terms of the resurrection of Jesus, that Thomas touched his hands and felt his scars. So in that way, we have a difficult time representing even the epistemology we need to have in moving towards the Bible. And the social sphere manifested in the Gnostification of gender and identity. Of course, this conversation has been going on, and that's how I found Jordan Peterson in the C16 debate. And here's this Toronto psychologist refusing to do pronouns, and it's like, what's that about? And the more I looked into him, the more I realized this guy's trying to heal the split world. Well, that had my interest. And he's bread pilling people, and people are interested in Christianity and the church, and people who I would expect had long gone down a one-way street. And I thought, well, this is something I need to pay attention to. And so, then of course I bit the Peterson pill, and I was down the rabbit hole, and I was doing maps of meaning and personalities and the biblical series and all the question and answers. And, once I find something that interests me, I'm on it like a Rottweiler. And, and I saw him working this psychological, mythological connection between the Bible and the cultural world we inhabit in a compelling way, in a way that I hadn't really heard anyone do before. And I thought, boy, this is really helpful. I have to figure this out. I have to read his sources. I have to learn how he's doing this. I need to learn to be able to speak his language and understand his thinking. I need to let him colonize my brain for a while and do a deep soak in him so that I can begin to understand how this is all working and learn from him. But I noticed in him a reluctance to fully commit to a unified world, and I saw that in terms of the resurrection of the body as mere myth. And of course, Peterson is open about it, but not definitive. And actually, what Peterson had done in my mind is make me more definitive about it, is to show me the poverty of it being a mere myth and the power of Thomas touching Jesus' scars. And so in that way, Peterson really helped me cement and strengthen my thinking of the resurrection. And you might say, well, you're a pastor. That should have been binary. Well, yeah, it was, but yeah, it wasn't too. It's also analog. And even Tim Keller, a celebrity pastor who I esteem and admire, Tim Keller talks about the fact that when he was in the hospital having surgery on his thyroid, he was reading N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. And Tim Keller commented about how that just really strengthened him in his, see, again, our language is difficult in there in terms of the understanding. And I like how Vervaeke goes into the metaphors in his new series. It solidifies, it makes it more real to me, more hopeful, and then other things light up in my mind, and I can begin to imagine the life of the age to come, and that gives me joy and hope and peace and courage, and more thinking about it gives me a capacity to talk about it and share about it with you, and maybe share some of that joy and hope and peace and courage and excitement that I feel, because I want you to share it, because it is such a good thing, and that makes me a better evangelist. And so, Peterson helped me believe more in the resurrection, even as he is, he gets cornered by Sam Harris, and into saying more likely not. It's like, come on, Jordan, you stood up to the university students, and you stood up to the Ontario legislature. Who is Sam Harris to back down to? Stand up and tell him what you've said 100 other times. I don't know. You said that, but you kind of weaseled out of it. Come on, Jordan, don't back down. Be that pugnacious Northern Albertan that the more you push, the more he pushes back. And Jordan Peterson, we love to watch reacting. There's something that's really endearing about Peterson in that way, is that he's not going to get pushed around. He's going to push back. He's going to speak his mind. Doggone it, he's a Wolverine, and you back him into a corner, and boy, you'd better be careful, because he's got sharp teeth and he knows how to use them. And part of us loves that about Peterson. And sometimes that doesn't serve him well too. But, come on, Jordan, stick to your guns on the resurrection. You don't know. That's a perfectly credible answer. Take that 3 years and figure it out. But now the challenge of this word salvation. The Bible offers a compelling representations of salvation. But they're tough to live into in literalistic ways. You have to understand the symbolism, and that's where Peugeot is so helpful. Gold isn't a good material to make streets out of. And abolishing the sun and the sea, when those are such glory-filled elements of a good creation, why have that in the Revelation representation? Now, again, if you understand it symbolically, you're free to say, that the joy I experience sitting at the beach is not something that God will take away from me in the age to come. Okay? It might more be like C.S. Lewis's question, and Peter Kreeft has some fun talks about this too, about the question of sex in the age to come. And Lewis has this terrific example of if you're talking to a child and the child hears about sex and is asking some questions about it, and then the child asks, will there be chocolate? and Lewis, the guy's so brilliant, and it's just a perfect illustration of sex is the kind of thing that chances, well, there might be chocolate sometimes, but it's the kind of thing that you won't be thinking about chocolate. You won't be missing it in the moment. Trust me. And so, the representations that we have in the Bible, streets of gold, no longer any sea. The point of that isn't that the ocean is bad. The point of that is, all of this symbolism of chaos and disorder. Sea is where, in the book of Daniel, the empire monsters come out and crush the earth, and there'll no longer be that area of chaotic disaster that threatens. I mean, that's the point. But in many ways, to say there'll no longer be the chaotic source of disaster turns wine into water, when you could say there's no longer any sea to someone for whom the sea has always been a source of anxiety and threat. Okay? So that's the way the Bible talks about these things, and representations and symbolism. But will future order, abolition of chaos, get tyrannical or dull? And so I start to think about that and worry about that. I was like, shut up, stupid Vanderclay. You think God hasn't thought of this? You think the God who could make this world, which is so rich and diverse and glory filled, can't take this all to the next level? And don't you understand that even the suffering in this world, he's going to take to the next level, and the age to come will be better for the struggle that we had in this age. That's clearly what the Bible is talking about. Well, how? Well, I don't believe it. Yeah, okay. Just like the kid doesn't believe, sex, give me chocolate. All right. You think that now, wait till you hit puberty. Your mind may change. Yeah, you'll still like chocolate, but there'll be other things you pay attention to. So, while Jordan Peterson isn't putting out this wonderful stream of videos like some of us fantasize he would, he's doing his book tour. And so we go wandering looking for some other things. And there's Vervaeke. And, the relevance realization for me is, I've been doing a lot of thinking about thinking over the last year, and why is it that some books are more salient than others? And now I'm over here thinking about psychedelics, and now I'm over there reading Jung, and now I'm over here reading Nietzsche, and now I'm over here doing these biblical studies, and back and forth and back and forth. And if you watch my video channel, you're like, the guy's got ADHD. Yeah, he does. He's all over the place. Yeah, he is. But hopefully he'll come around. Well, we hope so. I've got a million unfinished projects that I want to get back to, but new exciting projects keep coming up, and it's like, well, when the muse is here, go for it. So I've been thinking a lot about thinking since I've been on my little status bottle rocket. I mean, Peterson's been on a Saturn V, and I've been on a bottle rocket, but it's been invigorating. And so then, starting when I first saw some of Vervaeke stuff, it didn't really hit me so much. And now I start watching his stuff. It's like, oh, wait a minute, this stuff is interesting. I listen to more. Oh, this is interesting. And get more and more involved in it. And then it's like, okay, Peterson and Vervaeke, how can I figure out where these two come together and how they differ and what I can learn from the differences? And, how can I figure all of this out? And he goes into the axial age. And of course, I'd heard that before. And I had actually had a copy of Karen Armstrong's book that I hadn't really read. And it wasn't salient at that moment. Now it is. And it's like, well, why now and not later? I don't know. And so then, well, maybe Vervaeke can help me figure out why now and not later. And part of me says, well, that's the Holy Spirit. And yeah. And what else? because the God of redemption is the God of creation in Christianity. They're not two gods, they're one God. And so creation and redemption work hand in hand, and the Holy Spirit takes things of creation and perfects them, and time is an element of one of the tools in his toolbox. And so, now is the time. As Peterson says in the Vervaeke talk, timing is everything. It's true. So the axial age explanation, I talked about that in my last video, and it's like, yeah, when we explain something, we make it flat, and then then I feel doubts again, and then some other congressional factions are like, aha, the classic theists are getting weak. This is our chance, attack and gain some more seats, and maybe we can flip the administration of Vanderklay to a full-fledged conversion into, and you can pick whatever, if you want me to be a materialist, or you want me to be a Buddhist, or you want me to be a Universalist, or you want me to be an Arminian, or you want me to be a Roman Catholic, or you want me to go Orthodox. Have at it, y'all. They're all working in the consciousness Congress all the time. But another argument that the split world is a mere psychological psychotech adaptation. And then suddenly, I've got Freud, the 2 or 3 seats that Freud has in the Congress saying, hey, wait a minute. And Feuerbach, don't forget him. And that's, oh crap! Now I gotta deal with the Freudians and Feuerbach in my head, and I got the nagging doubts, and the materialists like, yeah, you should listen to those. They're making some sense. All those guys are talking in my head. And so the axial age, well, maybe the axial age is just psychotechnology. Maybe it's mere psychotechnology, and maybe it's simply a coping mechanism, and maybe the materialists are right, and maybe when I die, that'll be all there is, and maybe all of my joyful fantasizing about life in the age to come is just maybe it's just a pipe dream. Oh, maybe it offers me some adaptive advantage. Maybe, I just I opened PayPal last night because I was thinking of buying the new expansion to Civ 6, and I usually just use my PayPal account to buy that on Steam. And I noticed all this money in it, and it's like, where'd all that money come from? And it's a bunch of you. You're sending me money on PayPal, and it's like, because I kind of put Patreon over to the side because, all the Patreon stuff, and I really want to get a permanent platform that I can fully invest in, and it's not going to be Patreon. But a number of you said, well, Patreon's the only thing that works for me. So I said, okay, I'll leave that open, and I'll do the PayPal for those who said, I don't want to use Patreon. So I had that, and I didn't want to start Subscribestar because I want to see what Peterson, if he ever offers something, what he'll offer, and I want to figure this out. So I left it all open, and so thank you, those of you who sent money on Patreon, and some of you have sent me Bitcoin, and so thank you for that. And then I feel all humble and grateful and don't quite know what to do to say thank you. So thank you, because there's so many of you, and the little and the big donations, they're all really lovely. And some of you sent money to Livingstone CRC through those links. So, God bless you all. I would probably do it for nothing, but, there are days when it's like, I don't want to make a video, but then it's like, yeah, but those people sent me money. I should give them something. So anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, so Vervaeke's work, and so maybe all my dreaming about life of the age to come is just an adaptive advantage that helps me thrive better in this materialist world. I've got those elements of my consciousness Congress that are making those points on the Parliament floor. And my consciousness Congress looks more like the British Parliament, where they're yelling at each other than the Americans, where they just kind of stay in their caucuses and snipe on Twitter and social media and C-SPAN about each other. But, it's all going on. So then I was thinking about, okay, salvation. And I was thinking about, when did I hear Peterson talking about Nietzsche and Jung, and what's the last thing Peterson did? And he hasn't been doing all that many videos, so not that much content. And then, I was watching this one. And the way it goes for me is I watch these videos, and I know it's true for a lot of you because you tell me, I watch them over and over and over again, because each time I watch them, I gain something new. And it's like, how can I be so dumb? I'm not really that smart. And Yeah, the more you learn, the more you realize how dumb you are. That, gosh, why didn't I hear that the first time? And that's that salient stuff that Vervaeke is talking about. And boy, I didn't catch any of that the first time, and it didn't seem real. And so I'm watching this again, and it's like, oh wow, this is a really good conversation. Of course, both of them have a much better idea of what they're talking about because they've been living within it, but I've been doing other things, and then I come into it now having gotten up to speed to the degree that I have on Peterson and getting up to the speed to the degree that I can on Vervaeke. And so now listening to them talk together, it's like, oh, I much better understand this conversation. And then when I was thinking about, well, what about my ongoing project of trying to understand this idea of salvation? Well, actually, there's a lot in this that pertains to that. So let's do some streaming and commenting on this video because it's really good.
Okay. Then Nietzsche made one more proposition, which was that the only solution to that would be for human beings to transform themselves into meaning-creating creatures.
Okay, so Nietzsche is basically struggling with the idea of salvation, and that's one way to represent or frame all of human endeavor. We are trying to save ourselves. We'll save ourselves from what? We'll save ourselves from plague, from violence, from nihilism, from ennui, from conflict, from boredom, from death, from extermination, from everything. Salvation goes all the way across the board. And so Nietzsche's working on this. And so Nietzsche's wrestling with the history of philosophy up until his time. And with Christianity, we've killed Christianity. And so now maybe, meaning is very much involved in this because we've got to save ourselves from nihilism and from lack of meaning. Meaning is so vitally important. And earlier in the conversation, they had a good conversation about, well, what do we mean by meaning? And that's not entirely easy. So now Nietzsche is having his say.
And so the only solution to that would be for human beings to transform themselves into meaning-creating creatures. And so what Nietzsche basically did, and I think this was a mistake in his metaphysics, was that he assumed that the objective description of reality was correct, that reality in and of itself was dead and meaningless, but that human beings could interact with that in such a way as a consequence of their individual choices to make that richly meaningful. And
now part of where they're coming from is this question of where does meaning come from? Is it out there in the world and we discover it? Or is meaning something that we manufacture and put into the world? And actually, listening to this, a comment I made about Vervaeke was wrong, because Vervaeke very much sees it as a both and, that it's together that it happens. And I think that's right. But I'm also much more of the sense of, it's found, it's there. And this, of course, is partly due to my meta-narrative, my worldview of that the material world is dependent upon a consciousness, which is God. Okay?
That we needed to do that because the alternatives would be nihilism or totalitarianism. One more comment on that. So, Jung was a student of Nietzsche's, a profound student, and he was actually trying to solve the problem that Nietzsche put forward, which was, oh, well, we got nihilism on the one hand and we got totalitarianism on the other hand, and, those don't really seem to be very good solutions since millions of people die because of one and millions of people commit suicide because of the other. It's like those are suboptimal solutions in all likelihood. So,
and again, solutions for what? Well, these are suboptimal methods of salvation. Well, salvation from what? Well, salvation from everything. Salvation for everything. And this is part of, lately what I've been struggling with is, okay, what can we actually conceptualize what we want ultimately? Can we represent that? That's really hard.
But Jung, in some sense, took issue with Nietzsche's fundamental proposition, which was that human beings were meaning-creating creatures. And I actually think it's the most profound critique.
And when he said that, after everything that I listened to, yeah, that's right. So that makes real sense that Jung would Nietzsche would come along and say, we have to make meaning. And then you have the Übermensch, and you have the, the Superman, and he's going to determine this will be our meaning. And Jung comes along and says, no. That's not, we don't make this. It's in that sense. You can't just sit down and write a fairy tale. That's how Peterson says it in many places.
Critique of Nietzsche, because what Jung pointed out, and this is something that just blew me away when I first understood it, and it has to do with your relevance realization issue in a deadly way. It's like, imagine the things that attract your attention and your interest. Well, okay, so then you might think, well, is that a voluntary process or an involuntary process? And to answer that, you can think about it. It's like you're working on some dismally wretched, boring, and stultifying thing at work or as a student, and your attention is like fragmented everywhere. You think about the dust bunnies under your bed, and that maybe the dishes need to be done, and the dog needs to be walked, and the rug needs to be vacuumed, and it's like bloody well anything other than that boring task, even though you know you have to do it in order to, say, pass a course or pass an exam or get the assignment done. You can't control your damn brain. It's wandering everywhere. And then, so the weird thing about that is that you cannot voluntarily control your relevance realization. And then you have the contrary problem, which is that, there's a YouTube video about kittens, and it's like, bang, man, you're focused on that, And so,
and if you're just listening, he hits the lamp that's next to him, and now he has to fix the lamp. live salience right in front of us, right in front of relevance realization.
One of the things you might ask is, just who the hell's in control of this relevance realization? And that was Jung's question. It was like, well, where Nietzsche fell apart was that he assumed that human beings were primarily meaning-making creatures. But then if you try it, it's like, hey, I'm going to find it really meaningful to go to the gym 3 times a week next week for half an hour, and I'm going to push myself right to my limits. It's like I have every reason for doing it. I know why I should do it, but I'd rather sit on the couch, in my underwear and eat Cheetos. Yeah.
That's Peterson the preacher.
So you've got to ask yourself, man, who's in charge? And one of the things that the psychodynamic theorists were so damn good at was pointing out that, well, you think it's you, but it's not. And so then
And that's something that Christians have been saying you think it's you? No, the devil made me do it. Well, no, it's your broken sinful nature. It's the world, the big 3 enemies of, the sinful human nature, the world, and the devil.
Begs the question. It's like, where's the meaning coming from, and who is in charge? And so I know that's questions that you're trying to answer, but it doesn't exactly seem to me that we're overlaying that on the world, or that if we are, we don't have much voluntary control over that.
Okay, well, I don't think we're overlaying it on the world, and that's what I meant by a real relation, and I was comparing it to evolution.
And that's the real relation that I talked about earlier, and that's, when I was thinking about a book and doing a bunch of that was about, 7-8 years ago.
I think to talk about us being meaning makers in the Nietzschean sense is to fall prey to the romantic illusion that the world is a blank slate. I mean, you have the blank slate of the Enlightenment, in which, reason, the world writes on us, and then you have the blank slate of the Romantics, in which the world is a blank slate, like the unpainted canvas that Nietzsche constantly used the artistic metaphor, and he even created the idea of a lifestyle, as if our lives are works of art, because the world is just an empty canvas upon which we project our meaning.
Well, and there's totalitarian presuppositions in there too, because one of the presuppositions of totalitarian ideologues is that there is no such thing as human nature, and that people can be constructed in any way possible.
Exactly, and that's why existentialism comes out of Nietzsche, because existentialism posits that our essence and our nature is completely the property of our own self-definition. So what I'm actually doing is I'm rejecting both of those blank slates. I'm saying the world is neither a blank slate that we romantically project upon, nor is the mind a blank slate that experience just empirically draws upon. What I'm proposing instead is a dynamic interaction between the two. And to say that who's in charge is kind of an odd question. But before I answer that, I want to take a little bit of exception on your interpretation of Nietzsche, because I think it might help, and it also might get us back to the Newton-Darwin thing, which I promised to get back to too. I mean, Nietzsche lays, and again, Heidegger followed up on this. He actually lays the history of nihilism much further back, right? He says that the history of nihilism starts with Plato, and that Christianity is just Plato for the masses. Because my interpretation of Nietzsche is that the main cause of nihilism goes back to like the Axis Revolution. It's the creation of the two-world model. And the idea...
And it's funny because I listened to this video months ago, but I wasn't, I had heard about the axial age, hadn't really processed it. So this whole segment I hadn't really processed. Now that I'm doing a deeper dive into Vervaeke, now I'm working through these issues of the axial age. And so the split world, well, now suddenly I see it and say, wow, the split world issue is this is the divorce of heaven and earth. This is Genesis 3. This is the rupture in the system. This is the world as it is and the world as it should be.
Is that this world gets its meaning, right, its value. It has an instrumental value in getting us to some other world.
And right there are so many different ways to understand that representation of it. And earlier when I talked about being so heavenly minded as being no earthly good, that's one way to think about it, that, well, this world is not my home, and the only thing that matters is to get you to say the sinner's prayer so that your soul goes up to heaven when you die. That's an instrumental reduction of this world, and I think that's a non-biblical reduction of this world, because for God so loved the world, which is an amazing use of world in the Gospel of John, if you understand all the different ways he uses world in the Gospel of John. For God so loved this world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, or let's put trust in for belief, that whoever trusts in him shall not perish, but have eternal life, which is the life of the age to come. And so right there, even the translation of life of the age into eternal life is, it kind of sets us off in the wrong way. And so Vervaeke's point here is really important, that right away in this split, that split opens up the possibility to reduce and diminish this world, to make it that paper bag that is disposable and unimportant, and so we will just use up this world in order to get to the next. Whereas, again, Revelation, the end of the book of Revelation, is a renewed heaven and a new earth. And there's continuation, as we see in the body of Jesus. He has hands which have scars, but his body is creation 2.0 instead of 1.0. So
to some world in which we will finally find the fulfillment and the protection from horror that we don't find in this world. So,
and again, that's salvation.
A heaven and right, and then what happens, right? The way it wasn't just the clash between the scientific and the religious worldview. What happens is that the scientific worldview calls the second world, the heavenly world, into question. But what?
And that move right there is really interesting. Why does the scientific call the heavenly world into question? That you really have to unpack and say, what's going on psychologically in that move? When we no longer suffer here, we're more at home here, and so we no longer long for heaven. Now, there's some of that that's true. Is it that when we discover our agency to improve this world, that then suddenly we doubt, and God, the God of the gaps just got smaller, and so he's less useful. And in a sense, we would rather have an improved world here on our own terms than a promised better world on his terms. This is the exchange that's made at the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden. That, nope, I'll take my chances on what I can do rather on what you are promising. And in a sense, every rejection of God, well, that makes basically, if God came to you and said, I will give you an afterlife where you can have everything you want, but you have to design it yourself. Or door number 2 is the world I am going to design and give you. I think a lot of people would say, I'll take my designer world. And then C.S. Lewis, in this book, The Great Divorce, begins with that world, that designer world, where everyone can have anything they want just by thinking of it. No effort involved. Well, that sounds really good. What don't they have? Each other. Why? Because everybody's a tiny little master of the universe and they're alienated from each other. And so, like on the bus that goes from hell to heaven, or purgatory to heaven, when they're on that bus, they can't stand each other because suddenly they're having to deal with limitation. And they got used to having their wills unencumbered. But what's really nice about what C.S. Lewis does in that is it shows in that illustration how our wills are not what we think they are. Okay?
What's happened is we have millennia of Christianity and Platonism tutoring us to believe that this world is not meaningful in itself because it's only valuable insofar as we get to this heaven.
See, and I don't think that's a fair... Well, certainly it is true of some segments, but part of the difficulty of talking about Christianity is that it's a very broad tradition. And I think, it is exactly that reading of Christianity that I had trouble with, which sent me back to the Bible and said, is this really what the Bible is talking about? Is this really heaven and hell? No, it's really heaven and earth. And it's Jesus goes around in the Gospels and says, the kingdom has come. And, well, what do you mean the kingdom has come? And actually, I'm going to deal with that. I decided to do my rough draft after I do this video because I got to keep my eye on the time. I decided to do my rough draft after this video because actually in Mark 2, when it comes to the question of fasting and wineskins, this is what we're dealing with. That in fact So part of the blessing of my YouTube channel has been you, the people who watch this, and some of you have had conversations with Peterson and stories with Peterson and even recordings with Peterson, and you get permission to share those with a few friends and not post them on YouTube, and then some of you share them with me, and so part of what and actually he gets into this in this video a little bit, Peterson wrestles with is this question of realization. Okay, so Jesus dies on the cross. He's raised from the dead. Let's say that really happened. What then? Why isn't the world changed? Well, what happens, it's interesting, in the story in Mark 2 about fasting, Jesus says of his disciples, they're not able to fast while I'm here. Well, why not? Because I am the party. What does that mean? I am the life. And we experience this. See, romantic love, if you look at it through Lewis, Augustine, even, Plato to a degree, romantic love is a witness to this fuller and richer love underneath. And now we don't love Jesus romantically, but there's an aspect to that in our desire. And we experience that because when you fall in love, all you want to do is be with that other person. Love is blind. Love has rose-colored glasses. Listen to 1,000 different pop songs where you're the reason in my life, you're my inspiration. All I ever want is you. You are my life. You complete me. I mean, all of this stuff. All of these things are expressing this experience that we have of simply being with the other person is salvation realization. With I'm with you, everything is glorious. Now, obviously, in a relationship, that's the infatuation mode, and the rose-colored glasses will come off, and you'll have to get down to the real hard work of learning to love, because not only do you have love is blind to the flaws of your initial beloved, you're always blind to your own flaws, and as those lenses come off, and you've been doing all this mirroring back and forth in the relationship, well, suddenly you stop mirroring and say, why are you stopping? Why are you no longer mirroring back me to me? This is because you're a mess. Well, what do you mean I'm a mess? Yeah, you're a mess. And oh, you're a mess. No, you're a mess. And then off you go into you're gonna have to work through this if you want to have a relationship. But in the initial phase, it's all life with Jesus is everything. Well, what does that mean? Well, we can understand it through the experience of romantic love. And if you've ever fallen in love, there it is. But it's also that longing. So it's get into C.S. Lewis's nostalgia sense. Such it's very big. So what happens then? How does Jesus embody, I am the way, the truth, and the life? Well, when you're with Jesus, you're with the Father, and you feel it, and you feel it 100%. This is why his disciples fall in love with him, but they don't fall in love with him enough so that they don't run away when the heat comes on. And well, this is what we experience as human beings. But one reading of Christianity that Christianity is certainly guilty of is what Vervaeke is pointing to here. Okay? That's true, but I think it's not real. I think Christianity has the tools within it to critique it and to surmount it.
And then once science says, imagine that there is no heaven, all we're left, or John Lennon, right? Then we're left, my favorite Beatle, we're left, right? That really dates me, doesn't it? Then we're left with this world that we've been tutored for millennia has no value in it. And so I think what Nietzsche was trying to do, I agree with you, there's a romantic streak in Nietzsche, and like I said, I reject that romantic streak that the world is a blank slate upon which we paint our lifestyles. That is ridiculously hubristic in nature. But there was another thing Nietzsche was trying to do, and so I think Nietzsche has multiple voices in his anything.
Yes.
So in addition to the romantic project, which I often find really bombastic, there is another project that he called trying to revalue the earth, which was to try to see the earth as a place in which we could be at home.
See, and I think in Christianity you actually get both, because I think that song is theologically wrong. This world is not my home, and that's part of the reason that the Christian Reformed Church would never put it in one of its hymnals, because within our tradition we say, no, this world is our home, and it's a renewed heaven and an earth. So our home is to be with God, and this earth is our home. Well, that goes back to Genesis 1 and the end of the book of Revelation, that the way the world is supposed to be is, this is his footstool. This is his garden. This is his backyard. And so it is the presence of the King. It is the presence of Jesus, and it is the world. It is not an either or, and that's why the Bible is the story of the reconciliation of heaven and earth, and the divorce of heaven and earth and the reconciliation. That's actually what the picture of the Bible is, but the church keeps getting this wrong, keeps going down those rabbit trails, and in a sense, I think, keeps using the axial age trick. On one hand, the actual age idea is true in that heaven and earth have been divorced. But the axial age solution can also be a cop-out in terms of, well, we're going to lose the earth. And I think Vervaeke is right that science comes along and says, no, you shouldn't. And then Peterson's going to talk about that. I think the reason science arose in Western Christendom is, in fact, because the deep strain of the Bible says, no, this world is my home. But this world right now is, you get this from C.S. Lewis too, this world right now is under enemy occupation. Romans 8. Creation is longing for the sons of God to be revealed. Okay? Creation is longing for the enemy occupation to end.
On its own terms, for its own sake, that we could
Well,
find...
that was more Heidegger, I think.
No, Nietzsche talks about learning how to revalue the earth, and loving the earth is a repeated theme throughout Nietzsche's work, and loving the body is a repeated theme in Nietzsche's work. And because he thought that just like we had the two worlds, we had the two parts of us. We had the body, but the body only existed in service of the soul.
Right, and this again, you get into, and actually there's been a lot of theology over the last 50 years, exploration of the Hebrew nephesh. We are one thing, okay? And that's what, that's what the cognitive psychology has been saying. We're one thing. We're embodied mind. Our mind isn't just a thing between our ears. It goes all throughout our body. And And in fact, we are connected, deeply connected to our environment and to each other. And so there is a oneness that is around, but there's also distinction. And so you actually don't know oneness without knowing distinction, and you don't know distinction without knowing oneness. And so they're both in there, but that's why the separation of heaven and earth also gets manifested in the separation of body and soul. All right?
And the body, therefore, has no inherent value, because its only job is to get the soul to the only place where it has real meaning, which is heaven. And then his point was, if we lose the heaven and if we lose the idea of the soul, we have to get back to revaluing the body, revaluing the earth. And what I'm proposing in this sort of evolutionary model of relevance realization is exactly that the body and the earth co-create this real relation that fundamentally homes us and fits us into the world. And that the meaning crisis, and therefore, it's not just, I mean, yes, I agree, there are definitely historical forces for it, and the rise of science and the demise of the wisdom traditions and the religious traditions. But I think the meaning crisis is in some sense also a perennial problem. You see it cross-culturally, you see it cross-historically, because people can always get trapped between these two kinds of perspectives they can have on themselves. They can always fall prey to these kinds of two-world models. And so I think the thing I want to say is, part of what's going on right now in the meaning crisis in the West is we're trying to, and this is the way Nietzsche, I think, was prescient, as you said. He was a prophet. By the way, he predicted 4 things. He predicted that he would be famous eventually.
Although that he would basically starve to death in the meantime.
Right, but he, you know, Why I Am So Great was one of his...
Timing is everything.
Yeah.
Timing is everything.
Exactly. And so what he was prescient about is the fact that, I mean, basically since the actual age in 800, BCE and onward, we've had this two-world model. And now we're going through a radical re-embedding. And for a lot of people, that's caused a kind of nihilism. But one of the things I would throw out to you is that there's a possibility in an emerging cognitive science, and a cognitive science in which embodiment and embedment are becoming central, for appropriating that re-embedding process as a way of rediscovering how we can be at home, fundamentally at home in the world, and how the earth and our bodies co-create that home in a way that, again, protects us from horror and allows us to flourish as cognitive agents.
Okay, so you did something I think is lovely, and I don't think that it's people who aren't quite deeply educated can do, is you pushed the problem quite a bit farther back in time. So I want to one-up you on that.
Okay.
So I do think it's a deeper problem than Nietzsche pointed out. He pointed out the more articulated modern end of it, and we see that as the conflict, say, between science and religion. But if you can push these sorts of things back, I think, to the dawn of self-consciousness itself. And one of the reasons that I've been so obsessed with the book of Genesis is because I read Genesis as a dramatic representation of the coming to self-consciousness of mankind. Because what happens with Adam and Eve when they eat the fruit that the snake delivers to them, which is very interesting sort of phenomena from an evolutionary perspective, which I can talk about later. What happens to Adam...
And he will talk about it at length once he does the biblical series, but he's first got to get on his status rocket.
Adam and Eve is very interesting sort of phenomena from an evolutionary perspective, which I can talk about later. What happens to Adam and Eve is very, very specific. I mean, the first thing that happens, I'm sorry, I might get the order wrong, but the first thing that happens is that they realize their eyes are opened and they're like gods, knowing the difference between good and evil. And that's very interesting, because it associates the development of self-consciousness and the rise of articulated and complicated morality. And so I thought about that for a long time. It's like, okay, you realize you're naked. What does that mean? Well, you don't want to be naked up here on the stage, although if you're speaking properly to the audience, you are. But maybe you don't want that. Okay, well, why? Why don't you want to be up here naked on the stage? It's everyone's nightmare, right? Well, you're kind of flawed and saggy, and, there's parts of you that are not that beautiful, even if you happen to be a supermodel. And you're not as bright as you could be, and, your hair might be going a little bit, and, your teeth aren't that great, and you're not as smart as you could be, and you got a lot of flaws. Plus, you're going to get sick, and then you're going to die. It's like that right. So that's all nakedness. If you think about nakedness as vulnerability. And so we had to come to terms with her vulnerability when we became self-conscious. So then you might think, well, what the hell does that have to do with morality? And I did figure that out. It took me like 15 years of thinking to figure that out. It's like, if I know I'm naked and vulnerable, and I know you are the same, then I know what will hurt me.
And why do we want to hurt each other? What does this have to do with salvation? We want salvation from our nakedness. And somehow we figure out that I can gain well-being at the expense of my neighbor.
And once I know what will hurt me, I know what will hurt you. And so, animals prey on each other. Lions eat gazelles, and, worms eat lions and all of that. But there's nothing like a human being for sheer, outright, atrocious torture. And you don't get that without self-consciousness. So that's where I think the knowledge of good and evil comes. It's like it's no longer prey and predator. It's like torturer and victim. So that's one thing. And part of that sets up this dichotomy in human beings between whatever it is that our consciousness seems to be and our self-consciousness, and this terrible limited burden that we carry around as a body that we're conscious of. So there's that dichotomy. That dichotomy emerges.
The consciousness, this story that we experience ourselves as being, and then this body that is decaying. I remember visiting my grandmother again, my grandmother in the retirement home, and here I'm a 20, early 20 something, and full of health and life and hair and everything, and she's in her late 80s, 90 years old, and she says to me, I look in the mirror and I can't believe what's looking back at me, because inside I'm your age. And I thought, that story doesn't age. The age of decay, my body ages, my hair goes, I don't have the strength and stamina I had when I was 20. I'm stronger probably, but what's going on? What is me? The soul isn't subject to the age of decay. Well, is that real? Well, if you're a materialist, you're going to have to figure that out. If you're more of a classical theist, or at least on the other side of consciousness first and materiality derivative, well, no, that's not hard to figure out. That's who I am, and I'll survive this body. Well, then what is the relationship between the body and can the body be saved? Can the conscious part of me that does not decay, can that in fact spread out and save the decaying part of me? And now we're back into C.S. Lewis's miracles of the first and second creation.
Back at the beginning of the dichotomy of self-consciousness. It's a problem we're trying to solve all the time. Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity was that he believed that Christianity failed to solve that problem because instead of dealing with the reality of the catastrophe, which is, say, the degenerate form of our material body, the church basically damned that to perdition, describing it as a work of the devil, so to speak.
See, and Nietzsche might very well have said that. Nietzsche might very well have heard the church say that. But again, I think if you read, you're going to find some Christians that have said that, but many others have said no. And that's in fact the theology of the resurrection. That, well, yeah, this body is going, but we're given a new body. And when the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, a spiritual body, he doesn't mean immaterial. He means one finally fully subject to the Spirit of God and not subject to the desires of the flesh. Now, remember, I got into the salvation thing saying, yeah, we want to keep our desires. Yeah, but the desires are going to have to be in a hierarchy. All right? They're going to have to be ordered. That's Augustine.
And then concentrated on spiritual salvation. Now, you knew this.
See, and to me, that reading of Christianity is Gnostic. And that's exactly what, and it's prevalent in churches. You'll hear it in your church down the street. But again, if you read someone like N.T. Wright, who'll make the argument that that is a misreading of the Bible.
Element of spiritual salvation. Now, Jung knew this element of Christian religious thought and the Nietzschean transformations of that, and that's part of the reason why he went back to alchemy. Because one of the things Jung was interested in was, why did science develop? You know, it only developed in Europe as far as we know, and like the Greeks didn't have it, and the Romans didn't have it, and the Chinese didn't have it, and the Indians didn't have it, and it's like, well, they weren't stupid. What was up with them, and why Europe? What exactly happened there? It's not like we precisely know the answer to that, but one of the things that Jung suggested, and it's brilliant as far as I'm concerned, was that the cognitive apparatuses that we're blessed with are compensatory. So that if we formulate a theory about one domain and take it to a real extreme, the unconscious mind will start to formulate a counter proposition, which is formulated of all the things we notice that don't fit in with that theory.
And in other words, our consciousness Congress has a loyal opposition that keeps working on the other side to unseat the prevailing the party that's in charge. So if you're going to have Darwinist science, you're going to have creation scientists that are trying to unseat them. And you know, I know that there are a lot of people that wish creation scientists would just go extinct. I think it's a bad model. This is why you have religious freedom, why you had freedom of speech. Let the people do their work. And if they have a better idea, who knows, they might triumph. Well, we used to believe that you had Aristotle with the spheres, and then you had the Copernican revolution, and we look at that and say, that's an improvement. Well, if you don't let the outliers do their thing, you don't get those kinds of revolutions. That's why the whole system is important. And Jung's idea, I mean, again, I've never heard about this, got this from Peterson. It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
And then they start to flap around and associate with each other as a consequence of emotional contagion, and they start to manifest themselves in patterns, and that once that counterposition emerges as a sufficiently complex and dynamic living system, it has the opportunity to fight with the other system, and sometimes you'll have a revelation. And the revelation is basically the overthrow of the current perspective by the new emergent perspective. So, and Jung viewed alchemy in that light. He said that the Christian concentration on hyper-spiritualization was extremely useful. This is something Nietzsche agreed with, was unbelievably useful for the discipline of the mind. So Nietzsche, of course, is an anti-Christian, at least that's what he said. But he also said that Catholicism tempered the European spirit like nothing else could have. And he really meant the whole Judeo-Christian tradition, which was the attempt to force everything into a unified and hierarchically arranged interpretation. Nietzsche's idea was once you did that once, man, you could go do that all sorts of different places.
That's right. Once you learned that discipline, once that in fact was a skill, it was a psychotechnology, it was a discipline. Once you had to do that hard work of, we're not going to abolish the desires, we're going to rank the desires. That romantic love is a good thing. That love of your dog is a good thing. And it's not really a competition between my wife and my dog. I can have my wife and my dog. I can have my wife, my dog, and chocolate. And in fact, but these are going to have to be ranked, because if I have chocolate first and then my dog and then my wife, well, I'm not going to have a wife, and I'm probably going to let the dog die, and all that's going to be in my life is chocolate, and I'm going to eat myself to death. Okay? So it's probably going to have to be wife, dog, chocolate, because otherwise the dog's not going to survive if chocolate is higher than the dog. So it's going to be wife, dog, chocolate. And you say, well, why rank order them in that way? Well, there's stuff built into them that require it. And in fact, there's a structure to reality that makes the rank orders be that. And what Christianity says is, and I've made this point in other videos, you actually need something outside the material world to be at the top of your ranking. And Peterson actually makes this point with respect to, why didn't the Christian emperors divinize themselves? Oh, because David needs Nathan to come along and say, you are that man. You are not God. I will hold you accountable. That's why we in our American system say no one is above the law. That must be that way. You need something outside of the physical order so that everything within the physical order can be properly rank ordered. You need a God at the top. Otherwise, something within the box of secularism is going to be at the top, and it's going to be corrupt, and it's going to fall apart. You need something outside of the age of decay so that all of your loves can be rank ordered. And if you don't get that, you don't actually get salvation of everything within the rank ordering. That's why you need a hierarchy, and that's why the thing at the top has to be outside of the age of decay, outside of the iron box of secularism.
So, all right. Unified and hierarchically arranged interpretation. Nietzsche's idea was once you did that once, man, you could go do that all sorts of different places. So, all right. So alchemy, as a precursor to science, was based initially on a fantasy. And the fantasy was, if we paid enough attention to the transformations of matter rather than of spirit, that we could redeem what Christianity, with its emphasis on the spirit, had failed to redeem. So it's sort of like all the 14th century Europeans woke up and said, Christ died for our sins, and we're supposed to be redeemed, but a lot of guys down there with leprosy in the ditch, so it doesn't seem to have exactly, fulfilled its promise.
And this is a point that I've heard Peterson make a few times, and this is a point that I hear people make regularly. Okay, so Pastor, let me get this straight. I'll give you the physical resurrection of Jesus. So what? Let's say this guy walked out of the grave in 30 AD, and Thomas touched his hand, and they went up to a mountain, and he flew up in the sky and got hidden by a cloud. So what? People are still getting buried in the Great Wall of China. People are still getting cancer. People are still dying in wars. People are still starving to death. It doesn't make a difference. It's a good point. What has changed? And then you also have to figure in time. Well, obviously, belief in the resurrection, if you read N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God, N.T. Wright's point in that book is the greatest argument for the historicity of the resurrection, in fact, is the creation of Christianity. Because out of all of the worldviews, you would not get that from the Jews. And C.S. Lewis makes a similar point in Miracles. The only way to really account for the shape of Christianity coming from the historical context it came is that the disciples really believed the story they told. And you can even get Bart Ehrman close to that. Now, he will say the disciples saw something. He'll say they're wrong, but he'll say they're wrong based on the worldview assumptions. Again, go back to the other video I did just before this one this week on the Vervaeke stuff. His worldview will not allow for Jesus to be bodily resurrected. That's worldviews control things. And the materialist worldview is actually fairly narrow. And its glory is its narrowness, but it's also its weakness. Okay? So, but N.T. Wright basically argues that you're not going to get Christianity unless the disciples actually believe they touched the hand of Jesus. And if you listen to a guy like Gary Habermas, you go all the way back to within a few years of the claimed resurrection to get that. The Apostle Paul believes it from the disciples of Jesus, and he wasn't there, and he had reasons to doubt. I mean, he just saw Jesus up in the sky. That could be a vision. And Paul says, no. He rose from the dead.
And so he felt that the European imagination started to drift into the transformations of the material world.
So in other words, well, Jesus isn't coming back. And if you listen to millennialism, and I don't mean the millennials, millennialism, the near-term expectation of the imminent return of Christ has been with Christianity almost from the beginning. If you look at the time of the Reformation, for example, Martin Luther, during his time, everyone was sure Jesus was coming back because the world is a horrible place, and so you have those psychological tensions in play, and this argument, which was a very interesting one, basically says, well, let's see what we can to do to make the world a better place. Now, I don't think you actually need Christianity for that. I think everyone does that. So in other words, this might be an interesting contributor to the rise of science and technology, but I don't know that the rise of science was necessarily fueled so much by technology and the desire to make this world a better place as it was by the desire to know this world and love God with your mind. Because if you look at the theology of some of the early scientists, what were they doing? This wasn't, we're going to make technology for the good of people. That's going to be, oh, wow, we've learned this thing about how the world works, and the world is steady and reliable because God created the world to be steady and reliable. And, oh, we can use this and we can make things better. And so, science and technology are two distinct things. And whereas technology feeds off science, and science in many ways is dependent upon technology, they really are two different things.
But that was also part of what was fundamentally a redemptive process. It was just a more comprehensive redemptive process. It was, all right, well, we kind of got...
See, again, comprehensive if you buy that the message of the church was reductive. And I will grant that the message of many churches was reductive. Okay? This is get your soul saved and forget this world. This world is not my home. I'll fly away. But again, I continue to argue through this. I mean, that was what I had to deal with this word salvation. Is that what this means? And my problem with that word, my problem with that meaning was when I went to the Bible, that's not what it was in the Bible. That's what it was in the churches, but that wasn't what it was in the Bible. And I, as a good Protestant, had to say, wait a minute. These churches are supposed to reflect this Bible, so I'd better go back to this Bible and look at it more carefully and see what salvation really is from the Bible.
The Spirit organized. Now it's time to do something that was fundamentally a redemptive process. It was just a more comprehensive redemptive process. It was, all right, well, we kind of got the Spirit organized. Now it's time to do something about the dreadful body that we're dragging around with us instead of merely damning it to perdition. And one of the things that you might think about, because we're also thinking about practical issues here, is, well...
You actually don't damn the body to perdition, you just give it to the worms. Cycle of life.
We talked about multiple meanings, kind of multiple low-level meanings. There's the meaning of food, and the meaning of water, and the meaning of sex, and the meaning of being too hot and too cold, and there's all biological subsystems that take care of those sorts of things. It's like, those are organized hierarchically in principle, so there's something lurking at the top. And I think part of what religious mythologies do over years, centuries, thousands of years, is try to get a picture of what should be at the top. That's like the monotheistic impulse. What's the highest value? And here's something to consider. You can wonder about this in your own lives when people think about the meaning of their life. What they mean is, are all the subsidiary meanings meaningful given that there's an ultimate reality of suffering and limitation? And so one of the things that might be asked, and I think that scientists do ask this in part, is maybe we shouldn't deal with that question before we fix everything we can possibly fix. And so one of the things that I would also suggest is that when you're motivated by meanings that are...
See, and I'm not even sure about that. I think that's true in our frame of reference, but I don't know that that was true 200-300 years ago. It's always been a both and I think once we got sufficiently secular that we felt ourselves, and again Charles Taylor's, buffered enough, then suddenly we could say, well, I'm not going to worry about spiritual life. I'm just going to fix the world here. That sense of priority, I think, is a function of the secular age more than a cause of it.
Other than subsidiary, say the same meanings that animate mammals and reptiles and even bloody lobsters for that matter, when you're working at higher order levels of meaning, partly what you're attempting to do is to generate solutions to the micro problems of negative meaning that always beset you. It's like, well, is there something wrong in your family? Well, that's meaningful. The meaning is negative, okay? So does that make your family worthwhile or worthless? Well, the question is, depends on what you do with your family. And so the problem with nihilism, as far as I can tell, is that the nihilist presumes that the finitude that we perceive invalidates the utility of being. It's like, well, that's pretty arrogant, you might say. You might say that judging the whole world in that light, which is what that comedian just did on that TV show when he laid into God, I can't remember his name, blaming him for bone cancer in children, for example, which really does suck, you know. So the point is that one of the things that we find meaningful, and we could find meaningful, and that's reliable is, let's leave the damn question aside about the ultimate meaning of reality in its corrupt form, which is now, and try to fix the damn thing. Really try to fix it.
And this is where we get into salvation. That, okay, we fixed up a lot of it. Why do I still feel that something's missing?
And then see what happens, because it's clear that we can make things better, and it's bloody clear that we can make things worse. So you might ask, okay, well, if you organized your little value hierarchy underneath the proposition that it's up to you to work to bring the kingdom of God to life instead of hell.
Hear that again.
Then it's up, okay, well, if you organized your little value hierarchy underneath the proposition that it's up to you to work to bring the kingdom of God to life.
It's up to you to bring the kingdom of God to life. Well, that's where I got into, I need to be saved from me. Because if it's up to me, I'm really bad at a lot of things. I'm really bad at a lot of things. I'm not a good manager of myself in many ways. I can't control my tongue. I don't eat necessarily everything I should. I don't go to the gym as much. I mean, back to his earlier question about relevance or relevance realization. I'm not very much in control of me. I need to be saved from me. And so where I went to is if I had my little value hierarchy and I need to be in charge of saving me, I can't be at the top of my hierarchy. I need someone higher than me. And that's basically the first step of a 12-step program.
Instead of hell, then maybe if you organized your little value hierarchy underneath the proposition that it's up to you to work to bring the kingdom of God to life instead of hell, then maybe the whole problem of the negative meaning of life would go away. It's like, you never know. It beats the alternative, which is to damn the whole thing to perdition, which we really tried hard to do in the 20th century with a fair bit of success. Or, you know, just to think, oh, well, this is meaningless and useless and I don't have any responsibility and there's no such thing as meaning. And, you know, it's like, sure, walk down that road, man. See where you go.
And now the poor moderator gets in between these two. So, and that in a sense is again, usually where Peterson and I part ways. Because what I did then, as I continued to work through this, was salvation, rescue, deliverance. If you notice in my sermons, I always says misery, deliverance, gratitude. And I don't use sin, salvation, service, which is one of the things that my denomination, when I was learning catechism growing up, the 3 S's, sin, salvation, service. And I could walk through that. I was taught that as sin, salvation, service. I needed to get rid of salvation because the word was too fudgy. So rescue, deliverance. And so in my sermons, you'll often hear me talk about rescue and deliverance and self-salvationism, because we need to be saved from ourselves, because I'm a lousy savior. I'm lousy even at saving myself from the things that aren't that hard, like eat right and exercise. And, you know, manage your money and manage your time. And, you know, I'm too impulsive and I spend all my time making videos and, you know, and talking to people that I don't get a status payout from. And that makes no sense in this world. We need to be saved from ourselves. We don't know what's good for us. And we get A/B testing clues. Well, this is better than that. This is better than that. Go back to the video I was talking about Sam Harris and, you know, A/B testing and goodness. Yeah, there's some value to that. But you need your lodestars. You need your North Star. You need your guiding stars in order to actually, well, this right now, sitting on the couch covered with Cheetos dust, playing Civilization all hours of the day and night, that feels good, but I really should go to the gym. A/B testing clues, but we have serious problems with scaling up, and that's, again, for Peterson. And thank you, Jordan Peterson. You've given me tons of stuff. Piaget's equilibrated state. It's not only got to be good for myself today, it's got to be good for myself tomorrow. You know, it's too bad for you know, tomorrow Homer. No. Paul tomorrow is going to live with the consequences of Paul today, and Paul's a bad manager. And so it's got to go all the way. It's got to be good for my wife. And I've got to have my wife and my dog and chocolate all in the proper order. Because again, if the dog is above the wife, pretty soon I'm not going to have a wife. And if chocolate is above the dog and the wife, pretty soon I'm not going to have a wife or a dog, and I'm just going to have chocolate. It's got to be wife, dog, chocolate, so I can actually have a wife and a dog and chocolate. And they've got to be in that order. And so the equilibrated state makes a lot of sense because it goes out horizontally and it goes out vertically. And we need to be saved in every way we can be saved. There's no element of our salvation that can finally be left behind. And this goes all the way up, all the way down, and it has to go all the way down to the level of the creation itself and matter itself. And it has to run through time and history. And we don't know how that works, but I think we get, if you read the first chapter of Colossians in the Bible, if you read other things, you get the sense that this is in fact one of the things that God will do. And we can't do this. We don't have enough. I don't even have enough time in my life. By the time I get into my 50s, gosh, I finally learned something. I can make some videos. I've got something to share. But I'm already in my 50s. What do I got? 1, 2, 3, 4 maybe decades? And then my mind, I'm going to get less sharp, and the body's going to get weak, and you got to... And then I'm gone. And then whatever I've accumulated, whatever I've learned is gone. And then other people who are learning, but they won't have the stuff that I remember from certain times. And each generation keeps forgetting stuff. And, well, it's a mess. And so we need to be saved from something. And now you can have a diminished, less happy view of the world that says, well, your expectations and your ambitions are too much. No, I'm gonna ask for it all. I'm not going to settle. I'm not going to be satisfied with, well, someday they'll fix this. Well, I'm not going to be around someday. My time here is limited. And that's why I finally won't be a happy materialist. I think, who'd want to believe that? If you're a materialist, and in fact, the nihilism means that there is no ought, why would you pick a less happy way to live? Well, you can't really live in that faith happiness bubble if you really believe the other. No, that's right. You need to really believe the whole thing so that it can scale. And again, it's a hierarchy issue. Wife, dog, chocolate. No other sequence, no other priority list is actually going to work for you. And so you have the new creation language in the Bible. There's a new heavens and a new earth. And in Jesus' body, Jesus' resurrected body, you have creation 2.0. This is something we receive. It's too big to scale for us. It's way too vast for an individual life time frame. Human historical progressivist eschatology is too unfair to everyone but the ultimate generation, and that can't survive anyway. Yet, this is something we participate in. I have to take responsibility. I have to have agency. Now again, how I frame it, I always use misery, deliverance, gratitude, because the difficulty is that if I turn myself into a self-salvationist, then I run into trouble. But if you go too far into abdicating your responsibility, you run into trouble. And that's why the Bible seems to be a mismatch of these things. But and why we're always, in some ways, the whole Protestant Catholic fight, this is one of the fights within that fight. How can we get this language right? And the Arminian Calvinist fight, this is one of those fights. How can we get this language right? And we never quite get the language right. And so we always flop on one side or the other. And so because of your historical situations, you're going to be flopping on one side or the other. You're going to be on Team Catholic or Team Protestant. You're going to be Team Calvinist or Team Arminian. You're going to be, you're going to be like that. But one day, we look forward to these teams being set aside and our language improving, and we'll get it right. And it'll be more Calvinist than Arminian. It'll be more Protestant than Catholic. I'm sure of it. And I'm sure some of you are sure of the other. And that's fine. But again, salvation is first received, not achieved, but then we must respond. And it isn't real unless we respond. And so it isn't, and I know some people listen to me, and Calvinism means abdication. Not my Calvinism. So yes, we have to take responsibility. Yes, we have to take up our cross. We have to deny ourselves, take us our cross, and follow him. We have to participate in it. And if we don't participate in it, it's not going to be real. So, word that fudge, salvation. Yes. And I hope this made it a little bit more clear for you. And, 2 hours, there we are.